I'm going to read out my record thing. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for session 3 of the Section 106 training and forum. This training is being recorded. By staying in this meeting, you are giving consent to being recorded. If you do not consent to be recorded, please leave the meeting and contact the host separately. You can just email me. Thank you. And I also added this into the chat. All right, so now that we're officially recording, thanks for joining us for session 3 of the Section 106 Training and Forum. My name is Kathleen Philp, and I'm one of the Senior Historic Preservation Specialists for FEMA Region 1 for our Environmental and Historic Preservation section. For those of you who are unable to join us for the last 2 training sessions in August and September, we are recording these sessions, as I noted, and we can provide you an online link if you would like to put your email address in the chat. We'll also be sending these to VAOT, the Stockbridge Muncie community, and the SHPO if they would like to post these after all 4 sessions are complete. So these will be available online if you missed other sessions or if you'd like to share it with anybody. So this training has been organized as part of a treatment measure to resolve the adverse effects under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act for the DR 1995 VAOT Memorandum of Agreement. So I'm going to actually turn off my camera right now. Sometimes I have issues with Zoom, so I'm going to turn it off. But I just wanted to say a quick visual hi, and then we'll jump into things. Okay, so just to recap sessions 1 and 2, during these trainings, we discussed several different topics. We talked about FEMA's mission and environmental and historic preservation responsibilities. We talked about FEMA's EHP applicability to FEMA programs, both disaster and non-disaster. And we gave an overview of the National Historic Preservation laws, in particular, the National Historic Preservation Act. In today's session, we're going to talk about the FEMA Section 106 review process and streamlining techniques that we have. I'm hoping this will be a fairly quick presentation this morning, and then I'm very excited to turn over the floor to Jeff and Sarah from the Stockbridge Muncie Community Tribal Historic Preservation Office, and they will be providing their presentation after. So thank you again, everyone, for joining. Let's jump in and feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions or put something in the chat as we go along. Since I'm presentation mode right now, I might not see it, but I'm going to try and go over to the chat. You can also just go off mic if I miss you. Okay. So, as I mentioned, this is, there are 4 sessions, but this is really like a 3-part presentation. So we've covered parts 1 and 2. Today, we're going to cover part 3, which is the Section 106 review process that FEMA goes through. Okay, so let's put this all together. What does all of this mean? So first, we're going to look back to the implementation regulations for Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So these are found in 36 CFR Part 800. So this really outlines all the different components of the National Historic Preservation Act. So there are certain agency procedures that are noted. So federal agencies are encouraged to develop procedures to take into account historic properties during operations that respond to a disaster or emergency declaration. So of course, this is integral to how FEMA operates, since this is our mission, helping people before, during, and after disasters. These regulations also allow a federal agency to develop a programmatic agreement that contains specific provisions for dealing with historic properties in emergency situations. And what do we mean by emergency situations? This is spelled out in the regulations as well. So this is only applying to 30 days after a formal declaration. We can request an extension on this period, but just to be aware, some people hear, it's a disaster, it's always an emergency situation. When we're talking about these emergency situations, it's really that first 30-day period. So of really important note is that immediate rescue and salvage operations to preserve life or property are exempt from Section 106. That is just part of the regulations. We obviously realize that life and safety is more important than going through our 4-step process. So that's really important to note. So we understand in the immediate response, things have to be done right away before FEMA is even involved necessarily. So that, again, is exempt from Section 106. Okay, so we're going to talk today about our Section 106 programmatic agreement that we use. And in 36 CFR Part 800, this outlines the ability of federal agencies to have these alternate procedures for dealing with Section 106. So you can see that highlighted here, it says prototype programmatic agreements. So what are those? So in FEMA, we have worked with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation to develop a prototype programmatic agreement. And what this does is it helps improve and expedite the Section 106 compliance process for disaster recovery activities. So we're very fortunate in New England. All 6 of our states have a programmatic agreement. We would not be able to do our work and review the number of projects we have if these programmatic agreements weren't in place. They help on many levels. They help to streamline the whole process of Section 106. So I'm going to talk about that a little more in depth. And what they also do is, FEMA, we have staff that moves throughout the country, depending on where there are needs for different disasters. So it promotes consistency across our states. It also ensures flexibility and responsiveness to state and tribal concerns, because these programmatic agreements have been negotiated with the SHPO and TIPO offices, and they allow an appropriate level of consideration for historic properties. So we are defining certain types of activities that don't require a full consultation, and we've laid those out in these programmatic agreements. And then we're also saying, okay, these activities that are outside of that still require full consultation. And because we have these agreements in place and they're all based on a prototype programmatic agreement, our FEMA staff can go around the country and have the basic same outline for these agreements, so they know what they're working under even when they're in different states. And of course, each state and territory has their own unique concerns and unique environmental features and cultural resource features. So those programmatic agreements definitely differ from areas. We in Vermont, we don't have a coastline. The rest of New England, we do. So we have different things outlined in the other 5 states in New England. Okay, so let's jump more into this. Okay, so what is actually in our prototype programmatic agreement? And as I said, this is basically, the prototype was laid out and then it's modified for each of the states. So this is what you will find in it. We have the framework for establishing the agreement, which is the whereas clauses. We talk about who this applies to. We talk about the different roles and responsibilities, the stipulations for tribal consultation and public participation. As you may remember, part of the 4-step process of Section 106 is involving the public. And under the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106, we are recognizing that tribes have specific knowledge that only they contain when it comes to identifying certain resources. So that's also laid out in the prototype programmatic agreement. And then we have our timeframes, our communication standards, how we're going to consult. We talk about standard review processes, expedited review processes for emergency undertakings. So there is a bit written in there, like we will contact the SHPO, we will contact the TIPO and ask for a 3-day expedited review process if it's something immediate, like this building needs to come down right now. It's in immediate danger of falling down. So we will have that notification, and then we can move along with the process quicker. And then we'll dig more into this, but a very exciting part of the programmatic agreements are these Tier 1 and Tier 2 allowances. That's where the streamlining comes in. We also have treatment measures, which is a menu of agreed upon things that will help resolve adverse effects. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it could be like photographic documentation, archaeological survey, creating interpretive panels. And then we have the actual implementation of the agreement. Everyone gets to sign the agreement. And then we have appendices. And those can vary from state to state. Vermont has several different appendices from all of the other New England states. And in part, some of these were developed as part of this MOA for the DR 1995 VOT Memorandum of Agreement. So that's just a quick outline of everything. All right, so why am I talking about this? Basically, I want you to understand that there is the 4-step process for Section 106, which you can see on this slide. This is a little flow chart. So, step 1, we initiate the process. Step 2, we're identifying historic properties. Step 3, assess adverse effects. And step 4, resolve adverse effects. So that's the typical process. But because we have our programmatic agreements in place, there are little offshoots that we can take to streamline this process. So, okay, there is a FEMA, federally declared disaster. First thing that we're gonna do is we're gonna initiate the Section 106 process by establishing an undertaking. We had talked in the last session about how there are some things that are laid out within our Section 106 programmatic agreements. They're the types of activities that do not have the potential to affect historic resources. So these are things like paying for overtime during a disaster response, doing planning studies or updating hazard mitigation plans, things that really are totally innocuous daily activities that are undertaken, and they do not have the ability to affect historic properties. So those things are just cleared under stipulations. So those are laid out in the agreements. We don't even go through the Section 106 process. But if we define the undertaking and say that, yes, there is the potential to affect a historic property, then we're at step 1 of the Section 106 process. So this is where it's really important that we have an accurate scope of work. So if we're going to understand the potential to affect historic resources if they are in the project area, then we need a great scope of work, photographs, maps, accurate location information, a really good description of what damage actually occurred, because we're not consulting on the damage itself. Because that's, as they say, an act of God. What we're consulting on is the actual project to fix whatever that damage was. And we need to know like the depth of ground disturbance, different things like that. So that's what we're gathering. And in FEMA, we call them project worksheets. So for example, VAOT comes to FEMA, they get funds for disaster recovery, and each of the different projects that they have are put into a different project worksheet that our EHP staff will review. So as we're reviewing the project worksheets, we're going to decide if, as I said, the undertaking has the potential to affect historic properties. If it doesn't, it might need a programmatic allowance. It might need a programmatic stipulation. If it might affect historic properties, but it might need an allowance, we're going to see what that actually means. Because again, the programmatic allowances are a streamlining tool. Okay, so we've looked at step 1. We see these green highlighted areas. Do we have a programmatic agreement that's executed for our state or territory? Yes, as I mentioned, in New England, all 6 of our states have them. So then we're going to look and see, does the undertaking fit in one of a tier 2 allowances or a tier 2 allowance? And if it does, then we get to follow the line, yes, and then Section 106 is complete. If it doesn't, we'll move on to step 2. But here's the exciting part that I had mentioned. With the programmatic agreement, we have tier 1 and tier 2 allowances. So tier 1 allowances are those activities that have very limited potential to affect historic properties. What this typically means is there's very limited ground disturbing activities. We're talking about maybe repaving a road. It's within the exact same footprint. It's very minor. or we're doing repairs to a building or structure that's less than 45 years of age. So it doesn't quite meet that age threshold to be eligible for listing in the National Register. We also have Tier 2 allowances, and we have staff at FEMA that are qualified under the Secretary of the Interior standards. I'm qualified under architectural history, so I can, look at things above ground and decide if they're eligible for the National Register. We also have Secretary of the Interior qualified archaeologists, so they're looking at things below ground. They're the ones who are deciding if a project is located in previously disturbed soils. And this is where the educational background really becomes important. We have established levels of trust with our state partners, those signing our programmatic agreements, the State Historic Preservation Officer, the SHPO, or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And we're saying that we have qualified staff with the appropriate educational background to determine if something is previously, like a previously disturbed soil. So that would be our archaeologists who make those determinations. It's not just anybody who's on staff who makes that determination. And then for standing structures, which is the things that I look at more, we're looking for anything that might potentially be historic. We're looking to see if the work is truly done in kind. So we're talking about the same materials, the same color, size, things like that. So these are our two off-roads. We can either meet Tier 1 allowance, Tier 2 allowance, or a combination of those. And if we do, Section 106 is complete. We document this in what's called our Record of Environmental Consideration, and we move on to the review of our next project. If they do not meet the allowances, we move on to step 2, which is identifying historic properties. So you can see in the green right there we are, we're on step 2. We talked a lot about in session 2 how we identify historic properties and what that means. How do we actually go about that process? We're doing background information, online research. We're drawing from the photographs that have been gathered during initial site inspections of the project areas. In the immediate aftermath of the response. Sometimes we're going on site visits to see the project area. We're also relying on the information that is already available in state databases that discuss what historic properties are there, both standing structures and archaeological resources. And then we're looking ourselves to see what might be in that area. And then once we determine what is in this area, some of you might remember our area of potential effects, our APE, we're going to decide if something is actually eligible for the National Register. And that is where we really look at the historic context of this resource. And we're going to evaluate it against the 4 National Register criteria. So A, events significant to history, B, significant persons, C, its architectural or artistic ability, and then D is its ability to provide information about history or prehistory. And then we're also going to look at those those 7 aspects of integrity. So location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. So that's all that goes into writing a determination of eligibility. So if we determine a property is eligible, we move on to step 3 of the process. If a property is not eligible, then we're going to document that. We're going to write a no historic properties affected letter. We're going to send that to the SHPO and TIPO for their concurrence. And then if we receive concurrence, the Section 106 process is complete. But what happens if there are historic properties that could be adversely affected? So we're looking at step 3 of the process. So we're going to determine by applying the criteria of adverse effect, if there is an adverse effect to the resource, meaning that the integrity is so diminished that the resource might no longer be eligible for listing in the National Register. I like this little image. We had a project, I'm just going to say someplace I can say it's in Connecticut, but we were told that they were replacing a slate roof in kind. We're like, oh, wow, that's fantastic. They're going to maintain the slate roof. And so we see some photos, and then we see that the roof, yes, it's been replaced with slate, but it's red slate, so it doesn't match the gray slate. So it looks a little bit like the roof has chicken pox. So when I say there, we have those tier 2 reviews where we're looking to see if something is actually in kind. This would not match the in kind standard, because although it is slate, it is not the same color. So that would not meet our programmatic tier 2 allowances. So, as I said, when we're applying the criteria for adverse effect, we're going to see, so the characteristics of historic property, those character defining features, they can be altered directly or indirectly in such a way that the integrity of the resource is diminished and the resource would no longer be eligible for the National Register. That's what we mean by an adverse effect. But sometimes it's not an adverse effect. We're just looking at no adverse effect. There is an impact on the resource, but it is not so significant that the property would no longer be eligible. So in that case, we write our letter, no adverse effect on historic properties. We ask for concurrence. If we receive concurrence, then we completed the Section 106 process. If there is an adverse effect, we're on to step 4, which is resolving those adverse effects. And this training is part of the resolution of an adverse effect. An MOA was created, and this is one of those treatment measures that was determined through consultation in order to resolve an adverse effect. So as we're going through this process, as long as the work is not yet complete, there could be the chance to develop alternatives to a scope of work that could avoid or minimize an adverse effect. So if that's the case, if we're able to say, okay, if this access road is placed here, if there are archaeological resources, that will be an adverse effect. But then by talking to the project proponent, and if we say, what about this area? Can this temporary access road be placed over here to avoid the archaeological resources? Then if that's possible, and there are no other historic resources that are adversely affected, then we can have a no adverse effect, which is great. Or we can do other things to minimize, maybe shift a project design a little bit. However, if it's not possible to avoid or minimize, we're going to look to mitigate the adverse effect, which means there is an adverse effect. And now what can we do to make that better? And again, we're going to consult with the different consulting parties, usually the SHPO and the TIPO. And we're either going to develop a memorandum of agreement, or we're going to use what's called the abbreviated consultation process. And that is outlined in our Section 106 programmatic agreements. And that allows us to not develop these legally binding documents like an MOA, or we also could do a project-specific programmatic agreement when the effects aren't really fully understood. So those are the actual agreement documents that are signed, but we can streamline that process by using the abbreviated consultation process. We still continue consulting in terms of figuring out what treatment measures we're going to utilize. We develop timeframes for the completion of those treatment measures, but this can be a good way when everyone is in agreement to help streamline that process. And I just explained this, so I should have switched the slides before. But again, we've got this abbreviated consultation process, so it's really helpful when we're able to utilize it. Okay, so just to give you an overview of what is actually in these consultations, for people who haven't seen them, we basically have, an introduction. What funding source is this project being funded over? Is it disaster or non-disaster? We have a really, hopefully what should be a really good, accurate description of the scope of work, the project location. Then we're going to identify any historic resources. We're going to determine their eligibility. If we need to, we're going to assess the adverse effects if there are historic resources. And then we're going to have whatever our summary of our determination. So our finding of effect, if it's no historic properties affected, no adverse effect on historic properties, or adverse effect on historic properties. And then we're going to ask for that concurrence. So we're saying, do you agree with us? Do you agree with what we have said? And then we're going to have a lot of hopefully helpful attachments like those maps and photographs, design plans, different things like that. And this is why we are occasionally, or sometimes it feels like constantly, reaching out to our applicants for more information. We're going to send an RFI, a request for information, to ask for more specifics, because we really want to make sure that when we're starting this consultation process, that we have as much information as we can get. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes some information is just not yet available. So we work with the best information that we can. This just shows the outline of the Section 106 process in terms of timeframes. So we're very lucky that we have our programmatic agreements in place to streamline reviews for projects that are funded with disaster funds, our public assistance undertakings. The 30-day standard review process is cut down to 15 days, which is very helpful as we're trying to review as many projects as we can to get money to the recovering community. Then we have the non-disaster or the hazard mitigation grant program undertakings. They don't have that time crunch. So we just do the traditional 30-day review process. And then with the adverse effects, so in step 4 of the process, we can use the abbreviated consultation process. Again, we can ask for that quicker 15-day review process. Otherwise, for everything, it just is that standard 30 days. Okay, so I threw a lot at you. Does anybody have any questions at this point before we move on to our last little section? I'm just going to check the chat. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely. Go for it, Laura. Thank you.
I don't want to upend your presentation if this is being talked about later, but you had mentioned reviewing a project's adverse or no adverse effects and having the consultation where you can say, can we move the staging area over here, or can the project be shifted this way or that way to lessen impacts? And you said a phrase that caught my attention: if the work has not yet happened. What if it has happened?
Yes. And Laura, you are reading my mind, because that is going to perfectly segue into our next session where we talk about what if the work has already happened? What if that opportunity to avoid or minimize is no longer there? So yes, we'll jump right into that if you want.
Like I said, I don't want to upend your presentation. I just wanted to make sure that that's part of the conversation either today or the next time.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you. Yes. So I will jump into that. I'll just give, if anybody has any other questions before I jump into what we call after the fact reviews. If there are no questions, I'll jump into that. And thank you, Laura, for that question. It's really important in this process. Okay. So again, you read my mind. So project review, special circumstances. What happens if undertakings are initiated before Section 106 has actually occurred? And what happens with scope of work changes? Okay. So there is Section 110K, and this talks about anticipatory demolition and purposely trying to avoid the requirements of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So federal agencies are not supposed to fund undertakings, projects, where a subrecipient has intentionally avoided the requirements of the law. It doesn't look good, right? We don't want to say, yes, you can shirk the responsibilities of the law and still get federal funding. So if there has been intentional avoidance of the law and there's been a significant and adverse effect on a historic property, funding can be denied. So that has happened before. And so that's something for our, recipients and subrecipients to be aware of. Funding can be denied. However, there are definitely cases where work has been completed because it needs to get done. A road needs to open. This facility needs to be fixed. And in that case, if FEMA has evidence to show that the law has not been intentionally avoided, and an adverse effect hasn't been, I guess I don't want to say it this way, perhaps hasn't been purposely done, no, but what I mean is somebody has not specifically done something knowing that it could have an adverse effect and not really caring, just saying, you know, we don't need to worry about the law. We're just going to do it anyway. So if we can show that that is not the case, things were done in good faith just to return something back to pre-disaster condition or get things open again, get these towns functioning, then we can ask for an after the fact review. But what's really important is that after the fact consultation, it's not always feasible. We're going to the SHPO office, we're going to the tribes, and we're asking, hey, this work has been completed. Do you think it's possible to still consult under Section 106? So if consultation is feasible, if we've coordinated and the SHPO and the tribe say, yes, we can do this, then we're going to move forward with our Section 106 review. But there's the recognition that if something's already complete, we can't turn back that clock. We can't avoid or minimize an adverse effect. Really, at that point, we're just looking at mitigating an adverse effect. So it changes the way we look at that process, if you will, because we know if it's an adverse effect, this has already occurred and we can't fix this. There's no possibility to realign that road and avoid an impact, which is why I really love that Laura asked that question at this perfect time, because it does change how we're consulting in this way. And again, after the fact is not always guaranteed. A consulting party might say, no, this is not possible. We can't consult. And oftentimes, if that's the case, then the project might not be able to be funded because we cannot go through the Section 106 process. So just, you know, that's a key thing to remember. So, and I basically just said this, but if FEMA does determine that there's an adverse effect, it might be too late to modify the undertaking to further avoid or minimize the adverse effects, and we just have to mitigate. So this is when, if it's possible to consult after the fact, and all parties agree, we're going to proceed either with the abbreviated consultation process or we're going to develop an MOA. Another thing to consider, and actually before I go on with this, just to let everyone know, for those who weren't involved in the development of the Memorandum of Agreement for the DR 1995 VAOT project, this was a case where it was an after the fact consultation. The SHPO and the Stockbridge Muncie Community TIPO agreed that we could consult. So the work was done, the adverse effect happened, we couldn't avoid it, we couldn't minimize it. So we developed a memorandum of agreement for that case, to figure out what is the best way, acknowledging this adverse effect took place, what is the best way to mitigate this? So that just gives you an idea of what the background is for the development of this training. Okay, so there are other times where there's a scope of work change. FEMA will complete the Section 106 review process, and then it's done. And we have a little line, and it notes that unless there is a change of scope of work, the Section 106 process is complete. We put this in our official environmental and historic preservation record, and it's noted. And so that is a condition of all of our undertakings. So it says to the subrecipient, if you change the scope of work, you need to come back and let us know. So we're asking for those scope of work changes before the work starts. So proceeding with a scope of work change and not notifying FEMA of this review is treated as an undertaking started before the Section 106 process. So even if we've completed the review of the original scope of work, the new scope of work is really a revised undertaking. So that requires a continuation of the Section 106 review process or a complete new process if the scope of work has changed so much. So if we're not notified, this can result in additional costs, funding delays, or even denial of funding. So it's not just if the work's previously completed, it's if we've reviewed something and then there's a scope of work change and then that's completed before we're able to review it. So it's really that continual process. We need to know what scope of work is actually going to be constructed. Okay. So this is just showing what we've talked about pretty quickly, but we're going to go into an example, which is the specific example that led to the formation of this training and which is part of this memorandum of agreement. So just to quickly recap, we talked about the prototype programmatic agreements, how they improve and expedite the Section 106 process for FEMA. We have them in all 6 of our states, and we're very thankful for this. And in Vermont, I'm happy to say that we're in the process of renewing that programmatic agreement so it doesn't expire. They last for 7 years, and we honestly could not do our work if in the manner that we do if those agreements were left to expire or if they didn't exist in the first place. So we are very thankful for those. The programmatic agreements provide consistency across the states and territories. And then we've just talked about how it might be possible to do after the fact reviews for projects as long as Section 110K has not been violated and there's no objection from the SHPO or the tribes. And then we also talked about that scope of work change. So I'm going to roll right into our example. So this is the case study. This is DR 1995, the replacement of 4 culverts in Addison County, Vermont. So some of you might be familiar with this. Some of you may have actually worked on the project. But for those of you who have, just a little refresher of things. And those of you who haven't, this really shows how FEMA goes through the Section 106 process. So we reviewed a scope of work for the replacing a damaged 24-inch concrete culvert under railroad tracks. So this is one of the locations. There were, as I mentioned, there were 4 different culverts. This is one of them. So access would be, and the work locations, like where staging would be completed from the actual railroad tracks. So you can see there's a little pin there. I know it's tiny, but that's the culvert location, and access would be from the tracks themselves. So FEMA reviewed this project, determined that it met our Tier 2 programmatic allowances. We cleared the work in-house and we moved on. So when the project came in for closeout review, we looked at what scope of work was actually completed because we noticed there was a large cost increase for the project. So instead of just replacing the 24-inch culvert, it was it was replaced with a 54-inch culvert. So much larger. It's in the same location. Head walls and wing walls were constructed. But the real key thing is that they realized the need to construct a temporary access road outside of VAOT's right of way. So you can see this not circle. Why can't I think of the word? Anyway, you can see the big oval. There we go. You can see the big oval there. And it's really pointing out that temporary access road that was constructed. This would definitely have fallen outside of our programmatic allowances. This would 100% have required a consultation. And as noted on the slide, there were known archaeological sites in this area, which the VAOT was not aware of, but there were sites and they were disturbed by construction of this temporary access road. So originally, step 1 was completed. We defined the undertaking. We decided that it fell under our programmatic allowances because there was no new ground disturbance. Proposed access was from the railroad corridor. So our Section 106 review was complete. With the updated scope of work that we didn't receive until after the work was completed, there were changes. They happened during the design build process. which means that applicants don't always know where staging and access will occur until a contractor comes in and decides where these will be. So the scope of work changes did not meet the programmatic allowances. So we moved to step 2 of the process. Well, this is what, we would have done. And in that case, we would have identified historic properties. We would have seen that the temporary access roads would go right over known archaeological resources. At this point, this is when we could have done the minimization or avoidance. So that's how it typically would have gone through. In this case, we didn't have that possibility because the work was completed. But again, as noted, if we had applied the criteria of adverse effect, we had determined that the archaeological resources were eligible historic resources. We would have moved on to step 4. And this is where we could have proactively tried to avoid or minimize an adverse effect. Could we do a reroute of the access road? Could there have been some sort of archaeological site avoidance plan or a protection plan that says, the site is here, we will not go here, that sort of thing? So if the adverse effect could have been avoided altogether, we would have looked at a no adverse effect on historic properties or no historic properties affected. In this case, the work was completed, so we were looking at an adverse effect. This is where we asked the SHPO and we asked the TIPO whether or not after the fact consultation was possible. There was agreement from all parties that this was possible, and that is how we developed the MOA. So a good outcome of this case study is that there has been strong collaboration among the stakeholders as part of this development of the MOA. We have I mentioned that our Vermont programmatic agreement has a lot more appendices than some of our other states. And another treatment measure that was developed was Appendix G to the Vermont programmatic agreement. And this lays out a procedure for projects utilizing the design, bid, build project delivery process. So this type of case can hopefully be avoided in the future. It talks about a review process that needs to occur once this scope of work is fully developed, if there's the need for access roads, additional staging area, things like that. The project, this is considered a scope of work change that needs to come back to FEMA for review. It needs to be reviewed by other stakeholders through the consultation process, and that way we can correctly complete the Section 106 process and correctly determine potential impacts to historic resources. We've also developed things separate from the MOA. FEMA has been working with VTrans to look at, say, potential areas where things will be stockpiled or potential access areas, what we're calling off-site activities, things that go outside of the previous right-of-way. And we're looking to try and review projects ahead of time to front-load some of the work and see if we can say, avoid these areas are safe to use. And that way we can avoid adverse effects as best as possible. Because we want to learn from the past and we want to have, better projects moving forward. Okay. So that was a lot. Laura, I hope that answered your question about the after the fact consultation. But I just want people to take away that FEMA needs to review scope of work changes. We need to review them before they happen, not at closeout when we see that there's $1 million increase to a project cost and we go, uh-oh, we didn't review that appropriately. And with after the fact work, things that have already happened, it's not a guarantee that we can successfully complete the Section 106 process. That's really important to know. Because sometimes it just isn't possible. We want to get communities the funds so they can rebuild and rebuild stronger and better, but sometimes it's just not possible. So we need to see these projects before adverse effects happen. And just specifically to the DR 1995 culvert projects. These were archaeological resources, and because temporary access roads were constructed, we're not really able to go out there and say what is intact and what isn't intact. And so that information, that archaeological information that could have been gained from these sites or anything like that, or could have just safely been preserved under the ground, that potential, it's lost. So we're not able to go back and fix things because the ground's been disturbed and the archaeological resources have been disturbed. So it's just something important to think about when we're dealing with these types of resources. So that is all that I have right now. I want to open it back up to any questions before I turn it over to the Stockbridge Muncie community for their presentation. I'm going to check the chat. Okay, no questions in the chat. All right, thank you all so much for listening to that portion of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now. And Sarah, I will open it up to you. Would you like to share your slides right now? And I think if I just sit back, you should be able to share yours and it should be all set.
Yeah, thank you. I will try that right now and see what's happening.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us and for providing this presentation today.
Of course. So can everybody see this
Yes,
screen
we
right
can
now?
see it.
Great.
Mhm.
So like Kathleen, I will also be turning off my camera in a moment because Zoom has already yelled at me about my Wi-Fi today. But I did want to turn on my camera for a brief introduction. So my name is Sarah Regensberger. I am the program coordinator for the Stockbridge Muncie community. I have been working in the Tribal Historic Preservation Office since June of last year, so a little over a year now. I do have a background in archaeology. My background more comes in the way of museums, but I have been very honored to have worked with tribal communities throughout a majority of my career, which is how I landed in the position that I did. Jeff Benjamin, Dr. Jeff Benjamin is our Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. Unfortunately, he could not join us today. He had an on-site field visit that could not be rescheduled, but we have talked through this presentation in detail with each other. And so I know pretty much most of what he was going to say or what he would want to say. I am hoping that he will be able to hop on for a little bit towards the end to give some of his opinion, but I can't guarantee that. But his background, he's been with the Stockbridge Muncie community since 2022, and he has worked extensively with various tribes. He was with the Mohegan tribal nation in Connecticut for 18 years. And then he also worked with Salish Kootenai out in Montana. And he's gone back and forth between teaching and working with tribes and in Tribal Historic Preservation Office. So he has also spent the majority of his career working with tribes. So I am going to turn off my video now. In presentation mode, sorry, I'm going to stop my screen share for just a second. In presentation mode, I probably will not be able to see anything going on with the chat. So I usually have two screens, but I'm working from one screen today. So I'm just going to ask you to give me some grace and patience while I stumble through looking like I don't know how to use Zoom, even though I've been using it. Been using it quite a lot since the pandemic. And I apologize for my fumbling right now. But I also, again, won't be able to use the chat. So just bear that in mind. I will be having a section towards the end where I will open it up for questions. So just sorry, give me 1 second. There we go. All right. Here we go. So again, I am going to be speaking. Jeff and I have worked on this extensively together. There will be portions that will be my opinion. I am not going to speak for Jeff on that. And I'm hoping that he will be able to hop on towards the end so that he can also state his opinion as well. So assessing adverse effects. From a tribal perspective, what constitutes an adverse effect might not be the same as what the SHPO believes. I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study that is outside of Vermont, and this has to do with policies that SHPOs may have. In this particular case, this is about an archaeological district. where they are looking to mount a solar panel farm. And the policy of the SHPO office is that posts and post holes or poles don't constitute an adverse effect because each individual post or each individual hole is such a small amount. Our argument, and by our I mean mainly Jeff, Jeff's argument is that it does constitute an adverse effect because you're not just talking about one pole. This is not one telephone pole. You're talking about a whole field of solar panels that all have poles that will all be going to the ground, and they will be disturbing this archaeological site. And so this has been an ongoing issue that Jeff is still trying to resolve and he's still trying to work on. And ultimately, he wants to change this policy because when we look at and when the National Park Service looks at what sites are eligible for the National Register of Historic Places, they look at 7 qualities of integrity: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Those are the 7 qualities of integrity that are looked for. And we believe that projects like this overlook setting, feeling, and association because they're going to drastically change the landscape. This is, again, an archaeological district, so not much is available to be seen above the ground. It's contained of 12 sites, and they believe that they have successfully avoided or mitigated adverse effects because they're able to save or avoid one of those sites. But this is one of those situations where we believe the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Each of those 12 sites, while they may not individually qualify for eligibility, make up a story and make up a narrative and tell us more about the history of that area. And if you take away even one of those sites, it affects that. So this is an ongoing situation, but it does show that there can be policies or there can be beliefs where TIPO and SHPO are just not in agreement. And it may sound like we have an adversarial relationship. That is not the case. We don't want to have an adversarial relationship. And in fact, we actually have a very good relationship with this SHPO office in general. And that's because TIPOs and SHPOs, we occupy a similar role in the Section 106 process, but we represent different non-federal entities. So TIPOs, tribal historic preservation officers, obviously represent the tribe whose homeland is being affected and who may or may not be currently living in that homeland to represent themselves effectively, and one is representing the state. So we have a shared interest in preservation. We generally work very well together, and we want to work very well together. We don't want to have an adversarial relationship. We want to have partners and alliances, and we want to be able to discuss these and come to mutual understanding in order to move forward and make sure that everyone gets what they need in the end. So in that case, resolving adverse effects, what is considered a resolution? Because not all parties might agree on what constitutes an appropriate mitigation. So as Kathleen pointed out, this trading is in the MOA is the result of a compensatory mitigation to resolve an adverse effect. And thank you very much, Kathleen, for going into a lot of the details. I read through the MOA, but it's very nice to know how things work without there being legalese in the way to our understanding. So there were a lot of different treatment measures that were taken to compensate for the fact that we could not actually consult on where this access road was going and to potentially save or avoid the adverse effects involved. And that is where I also come in. One of my major roles since I was hired has been working directly on this MOA with FEMA and the VAOT on all the various aspects. So if you had attended or seen any of the recordings of the webinar series that was earlier this year, that was part of this MOA, as well as several interpretation panels and a virtual tour that we are currently working on. So that all came out of this MOA. But the main point is that we, as the TIPOs, don't even want to get to mitigation. We want to not even reach that point. We want to look at avoidance or encapsulation or a redesign where we, maybe can save a portion or change how things are going. We want to get creative. We don't want to just go and plow through the archaeology and say that nothing can be done. A phase 3 or a compensatory mitigation. That's our last resort. If it gets to mitigation, we often consider it a loss. And I will also say, I've spoken with Jeff before about other projects. We, as you can imagine, work with many different federal and state partners on a variety of projects. The homelands for the Stockbridge-Munsee revolve around the Hudson, the Housatonic, and the Delaware River. So you can imagine we do a lot with water and waterways. And he has talked in the past about how projects, we've had to talk to the EPA and those partners. And and what ends up happening is that they will do something in association for the sturgeon, for example, because sturgeon waterways and trying to get them to repopulate. And maybe you say, yeah, sure, because sturgeon don't have a voice for themselves. But and again, this is where I am stating my opinion. The sturgeon may not have a voice for themselves, but we also represent a tribal people who have been dispossessed of their land for hundreds of years, who were shuffled around for over 100 years and when I mean shuffled around, I mean that in almost a literal sense of the word, until they reached their current reservation in Wisconsin, who many of them cannot come and return to their homelands or visit or have the chance to live and work out here the way that some others do. And that can I describe encapsulation further? I'm very glad that Zoom is giving me pop-ups. Sure, I'll finish my sentence and then I will discuss encapsulation. So we're representing people who for hundreds of years have also not had a voice. And so sometimes you need to balance the needs of multiple parties. So what is encapsulation? Encapsulation literally means you are covering the archaeological site in some manner to avoid any further damage, because damage that can be done from an access road, for example, comes from heavy machinery and the compression that happens in the soil, and that it damages all of the artifacts and possibly ancestors that might be down there, and that we don't know who or what is down there. And so encapsulation can come in a variety of ways. So probably one of the most well-known is, just literally pouring cement over the site. But it literally is a covering of the site to avoid any of that sort of pressure damage. And these are, again, situations or solutions that we can come up with when we have the chance to talk together. It's never off the table to do something like that. The only thing is, maybe it's cost prohibitive, and then we would want to look at another solution. But these are what we mean by creative solutions. We want to make sure that, we understand the need for this work to be done. We all have cars, we all use for transportation. We all very aware and understanding of why this work is necessary. But we also, again, we have the tribe that we represent to consider. And so on the heels of this, and as we've been doing all these webinar trainings and working through this MOA and this Section 106, we were notified this summer that there was another situation with FEMA, with the VAOT and our partner, the National Railroad Association. And I know that there were some people who had labeled themselves as from the NRA at our last session. I don't know if they're here. I couldn't see anybody labeled as such, but if you are from NRA, hi, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I'm not going to get into too much detail other than to say that Section 106 does not appear to have been completed properly in that situation as well. It is still undergoing. We're still trying to figure out what is happening. And, again, in my opinion, for the purposes of this talk, I am not 100% sure it even matters that we know at this moment when we're talking to you guys, the details of what happened, because I believe that most cases like this, it's not malicious. It might be coming from a place of ignorance or well-intentioned, but it's not malicious. You are not intentionally trying to keep us from talking or getting involved. But I also want you to think about the way that this having to receive these after the fact reports, or every time this comes in, how that impacts our office. You know, I am not familiar enough with VOT to know how big the departments are, to know how many departments there are, to know how many people you might work with or who might work with Section 106 on a daily or monthly basis. But I imagine that there are many people in and around that department. When you were talking to the Stockbridge Muncie Communities Travel Historic Preservation Office, we are an office of 3. Before I joined, we were an office of 2. And realistically speaking, we have 1.5 people working on the Section 106. I do help Jeff with Section 106 consultations, but I also have other duties within the office and other areas of expertise. And he is our official voice when it comes to Section 106 and everything that our final determinations with Section 106. So you are mainly dealing with one person who is looking at 72 counties in 8 states. So every time we have to hear about something like this, it adds an extra burden onto our office that could have been easily mitigated by talking to us first. And again, I'm not saying it's malicious, but it still takes a toll on all of us. And it's not this is, you know, Section 106 is not an ask for forgiveness instead of permission, because that's not the way that we want to conduct partnerships. It's not the way that we want to conduct alliances, and it's just not the way consultation is done. So I'm going to leave off that section with a quote from one of our NRA partners that Jeff had, I'm probably paraphrasing because this is what Jeff had told me, but that, you know, if any one of those bridges was built with subpar materials in violation of the understanding of how things should be done, that bridge would have to be totally removed and replaced with proper material. So this Section 106 process is no different. So if the process and expectations are not followed, that does need to be corrected. And lastly, but certainly not least, there is an element to Section 106 and why it's necessary because of government to government consultation. So federal agencies like FEMA, like NRA, have a trust responsibility towards the tribes they work with. And federal tribes are considered sovereign entities. So the United States is the only country in the world that has this relationship with their indigenous population. It's the result of years of treaties and federal acts that make up part of Indian law. And therefore, sovereignty and agency of the consulting tribes must be respected. And just because you don't work for a federal agency doesn't mean that the government to government consultation process isn't as important. We totally understand, because your state is also a sovereign entity, and a partnership needs to exist between us to exist for our shared interest in preservation and for representing our constituents. And, you know, last but not least, when dealing with program alternatives such as MOAs, sorry, I see the chat popping up. I will look at it in just 1 second. So when dealing with program alternatives, what is the kind of signatory we want to be, like such as an MOA? Because it's possible we may not want to be a signatory at all. Just from the perspective of Stockbridge Muncie community and our office and our capabilities, that usually has to go up a chain of command. We usually have to deal with lawyers, and it goes to the tribal council, and it can be a very long and lengthy process. And sometimes we are able to execute the MOA without necessarily having to become a signatory. But that being said, we still want to be involved in describing what the program alternative says. We still want to be involved again in that consultation process. We want to be given the chance to say our voice and give our opinion on the topic. So I'm going to open up the chat real quick. I think okay, so final thoughts. Let's see. What is this message? I am one of the executive staff of VOT, and I want to ask if VOT is able to communicate with your office directly, or do we have to work through the federal officer to coordinate with you? I am sensitive to honoring the government to government communications protocols. So every federal officer in particular has, they are the official representative. I would say at the very start, you do have to have that federal officer involved. And it may come through that initial consultation that all parties are okay with you having direct communication. But that, again, you have to involve that federal officer at the very beginning, and that has to be a shared understanding of everyone involved that there can be more direct communication. So again, final thoughts, and unfortunately, I don't believe Jeff was able to hop on. So I know that he would be willing to answer some questions if you had any at a later date, and I can, hold on to those and try to get back to people after discussion with him. But, neither Jeff nor I are Native American. I personally feel very honored and privileged to be able to work in the position that I do and to have the trust that I do to be able to use my knowledge and expertise in this way for the benefit of the tribe. And I know that I feel very passionately about it because I am representing a group of people, again, who have been dispossessed for so many years and who historically have not really been able to have a voice, or at least not had their voice be respected in the same way. And so when I am given opportunities like these to talk directly with people, to make a direct effect on the outcomes, I don't take that lightly. And I know that Jeff doesn't either, in the same way that I know that you don't take your job and the representation and all the responsibilities that you have for your constituents lightly either. So on that note, I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Kathleen for facilitating this and again, going through the DR 1995, and also Laura for showing up and for asking her question earlier. Thank you so much for that. So I am going to stop talking, give people the chance to either ask their questions in person or in the chat, and I would love to have a discussion with you guys.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a wonderful presentation, and we really appreciate hearing the Stockbridge-Muncie perspectives on the Section 106 process and the impacts of the Section 106 process on the tribe. So thank you. And I also really appreciate you. This was a great way to end this session, emphasizing the government-to-government relationship. We talked about that in possibly session 1, but that's a really important thing to reiterate, that it is a government-to-government relationship. So thank you again, Sarah. And just quickly to Michelle's question, as Sarah mentioned, if VAT, if this is a FEMA funded undertaking, we'll go through that initial Section 106 process, and that is how we will reach out to the tribe. And then, as she said, like, if later on there's an agreement to do direct communication with the tribe, that can happen. But that initial Section 106 consultation will come from FEMA. And Laura, you came on, so I think you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. To Michelle's question, I wanted to add that we have other agreement documents, programmatic agreements that address the consultation, whether it's VTrans and the federal agency together, or, definitely respecting that government to government. And to Sarah's point, I want to reiterate that we are partners, and we do consult and have conversations together, do site visits when possible, but we also fully respect that they are more federal government to federal government than we are, and they look at things differently. Sarah mentioned several times ancestors, and we're not looking archaeologically in that way until bones are found, to be quite honest, right? So Sarah and the TIPO are looking at these locations in a different way than we are. And I think it makes a project much stronger to have that partnership. But I want to reiterate that SHPO can in no way tell you how the TIPO is going to review or react. And we're very conscious of that, and we respect how they look at it, and we're very interested in it.
Thank you so much, Laura. And I really appreciate, Sarah, I appreciate you being able to come on, you and Jeff putting together that presentation. I know we all learned a lot from that. And I would like to, well, thank everyone for coming today. And I'd like to encourage you to join us for our final session, session 4. That'll take place October 24th. Same time, same place, virtually on Zoom at 9 a.m. And at that time, Laura, our Vermont SHPO, and her staff will provide a presentation from their perspective. So thank you again, everyone. I'll leave it open another moment for any questions in the chat, or if anybody wants to just raise their hand or come off mic. I'll give it another moment. Oh, and it looks like, okay, we do have a question from Paul Libby, who's a senior project manager. We're going through a review of the Section 106 process with FRA. And as you indicated, there are some missteps along the way. And we at VTrans are committed to working together to resolve this 100%. Okay, so this is speaking to what Sarah, what you were talking about. So that's great to see. VTrans is committed to working to resolve this 100%. So thank you. So Paul, Sarah, if there's anything you need to discuss on offline, you can always do that. So thank you. Okay, great. And seeing no other hands up or anything, thank you all again. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being here. And we look forward to seeing you in October for our final session. So have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Kathleen.
Thank you.